Jerry Adler carried the lifetime of grief and silence, standing before his neighbors as a man long broken by loss. Whispers painted him as cold and distant, the kind of soul people quietly judged but never truly knew. And then a 10-year-old boy's innocent question shattered the darkness and brought a truth no one expected. But only listen to how this night turned into a revelation for the whole town, and why, in the end, hope and justice prevailed. The hall was nearly full that night. Rows of wooden chairs lined the room, and families sat shoulder to shoulder, coats draped over laps, hands folded. There was a certain warmth in the air, gentle chatter, the sound of neighbors greeting one another, the shuffle of papers as people prepared to share their stories. The evening was meant to be simple, a gathering of voices, a chance for ordinary lives to leave behind extraordinary echoes. At the front of the hall stood Jerry Adler. He looked uneasy beneath the dim lights. 70 years had bent his shoulders and carved lines into his face, but it was more than age that weighed him down. His hands trembled as they clutched the wooden podium, not just from time's steady hand, but from something deeper, harder to name. His eyes, pale and tired, seemed fixed on a distance no one else could see. Jerry's life was no secret. He had worked decades at the factory, rising before dawn, returning home after dark. He had buried his wife far too early, and in the years that followed, the closeness with his children had quietly unraveled until only silence remained between them. He was not a man who smiled at neighbors or lingered at doorsteps. He walked with a heavy step, greeted people with a nod and little more. The room responded with unease. People shifted slightly in their seats, studying him with a mix of curiosity and doubt. Some whispered in hushed voices, "He's always been so cold. Never says much to anyone." And in that moment it seemed true. Jerry's lips moved once, then stilled. He cleared his throat, tried again, but no real words came. His shoulders tightened as though he was bracing himself against the stares of the crowd. For a moment, it looked as though he would step away without speaking, retreat into the shadows he had lived in for so long. But then, something unexpected. From the very first row, a hand lifted, small, certain, unafraid. It belonged to Ethan Miller, a boy of 10 with bright, searching eyes. His voice rose into the hush of the hall, steady and clear in its innocence. "Mr. Adler, do you know Jesus?" The words hung in the air like a bell struck in silence. Conversations ended mid-breath. The quiet shuffle of feet, the rustle of jackets, everything stopped. Every head turned toward Jerry. The old man froze. His fingers tightened on the podium, knuckles whitening. His chest lifted with a sudden sharp breath. His lips parted, but no sound escaped. And then, for the first time that evening, the mask slipped. His eyes, so long dulled by distance and silence, flickered with something raw. Not anger, not embarrassment, something far more fragile. A trace of humanity breaking through, an old wound rising to the surface. The room felt it. People leaned forward unconsciously, pulled closer by the weight of the moment. The boy lowered his hand but kept his gaze on Jerry, unflinching, innocent, waiting. And in that fragile stillness, with 100 eyes upon him and one child's question pressing against his silence, Jerry Adler stood trembling, caught between the life he had lived and the truth he had long buried. The hall held its breath. The boy's words pierced Jerry's heart with a force he had not expected. For a moment his knees seemed to weaken. He stepped forward, gripping the edge of the podium as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His voice cracked when he finally spoke, trembling, uncertain but painfully honest. "You know, son, once I did. Once I knew him, but then I lost him." The room seemed to tighten around those words. Silence pressed in, broken only by the faint creak of a chair. Jerry lowered his gaze, and then, as if a dam had finally broken, he began to share what he had kept hidden for decades. He told them of his youth when he had sung in the church choir, his voice rising with others in hymns that had once filled him with hope. He spoke of how he had believed in light, in goodness, in the idea that life carried meaning. But then came the years that stripped it all away. There was the war, where he lost his brother, his best friend, the one who had always stood beside him. There was the long silence that followed, when grief settled in his chest like a stone. There was the slow illness that took his wife Catherine, the love of his life, leaving him alone in an empty house. And then came the bitterness, an anger not just at the world, but at the very God he once trusted. For years he lived like a machine, work, home, sleep, repeat. No joy, no purpose, only the hollow rhythm of survival. He confessed that he had turned away from everyone who tried to reach him, neighbors, friends, even his own children, because it seemed easier to be alone than to risk breaking apart in front of anyone else. As he spoke, the room began to change. Somewhere in the back, a woman lifted her hands to her face. unable to hold back tears. A man shifted uncomfortably, his eyes wet though he tried to hide it. Even the pastor, who had expected little from Jerry that night, furrowed his brow in astonishment. He had not imagined such a confession from the man who had always seemed so distant, and there at the very front sat young Ethan. His eyes were wide, his small hands gripping the edge of his chair. He was too young to know the details of war or the weight of burying a spouse, but he understood pain. He felt it radiating from Jerry's words as though it were his own. Still, beneath the sorrow, there was something else. In Jerry's broken voice, in the trembling pauses between sentences, there was more than grief. There was the sound of a man who had lived too long in silence, a man whose loneliness had become his only companion. For the first time in years, that loneliness had been spoken aloud. And the room, every person in it, felt the weight of one soul carrying decades of sorrow, finally daring to set it down in front of them. Ethan raised his hand again. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost fragile, yet it carried through the hall with unmistakable clarity. "Mr. Adler, maybe Jesus never left you. Maybe you were just crying too hard to hear him." The words seemed impossibly simple, even naive, yet in their innocence they cut straight through the heaviness of the room. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Jerry froze where he stood, the child's words settling on him like light piercing through the darkest of clouds. His shoulders trembled. The old man's chest rose and fell unevenly, as if he were fighting something deep inside. And then, for the first time in decades, Jerry allowed himself to break. Tears welled in his eyes and spilled freely, no longer hidden behind a mask of silence. At first it was quiet, just a trembling lip, a shaky breath. But the sobs grew heavier, raw, unrestrained. His knees weakened, and there, in front of everyone, Jerry sank down onto the stage floor. He wept openly, his hands still clutching the podium, as if to steady himself against the flood of years finally released. A ripple moved through the audience. Some gasped softly, others bowed their heads. And then it happened. One by one, people began to cry with him. A woman in the second row pressed her hands over her face. A young man stood, crossed the aisle, and placed a steadying hand on Jerry's shoulder. The pastor, eyes shining, stepped forward. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around the weeping man, not as a leader comforting a member of his flock, but as one human being holding another who had carried too much for too long. And then the applause began. It was not polite, not routine. It rose like a wave of solidarity, clapping hands, muffled sobs, voices breaking into shouts of encouragement. The sound filled the hall, echoing against the wooden walls, carrying with it the unmistakable weight of shared humanity. In that moment, the entire atmosphere shifted. What had begun as an awkward evening of reluctant stories became something else entirely, an awakening. No one in that room doubted what they were witnessing. It was not rhetoric. It was not performance. It was the unguarded heart of a man, cracked open by the innocence of a child's question, revealed at last to the world. And as Jerry wept, and as the room joined him, every soul present felt the same truth. They were no longer spectators. They were witnesses to something real. When the applause finally began to fade, the sound echoing softly into silence, Jerry steadied himself and slowly rose to his feet. For a moment he stood motionless, breathing heavily, as though gathering the strength to face the eyes fixed upon him. His face was wet, lined with streaks of tears that caught the dim light, but in those pale eyes, eyes that had seemed so lifeless at the start of the night, there was now a quiet radiance. He turned his gaze toward Ethan, the boy who had spoken the words that unlocked his silence. For a few seconds, nothing was said. The old man and the child simply looked at each other across the space that had separated their worlds, one marked by loss and years of solitude, the other by innocence and a faith unshaken by sorrow. The weight of decades and the purity of youth met in that silence. And then Jerry spoke. His voice trembled, but no longer with fear. This time it carried warmth, gratitude, and something like hope. "Thank you, son. You've reminded me of something I had forgotten. That faith isn't about holding every answer. It's about the questions we dare to ask, even when we're afraid." The words were simple, yet they rang through the hall with the weight of truth. They seemed to settle into every corner, touching hearts in ways that sermons and speeches often could not. For many, it was not just Jerry speaking. It was as though life itself had chosen that moment to remind them of what truly mattered. Slowly, the audience began to rise. First a few, then the entire room stood on their feet. The sound of chairs scraping against the wooden floor blended with muffled sobs and whispered prayers. Neighbors embraced each other. Strangers reached out for hands they had never held before. The atmosphere was no longer that of a modest town gathering. It had become something sacred, something unforgettable. Some closed their eyes and prayed aloud, their voices rising and overlapping, forming a chorus of fragile yet fervent belief. Others simply stood in silence, hands pressed to their faces, moved beyond words. Tears ran freely, but these were not tears of despair. They were tears of release, of recognition, of awe at having witnessed something undeniably real. Even those who had come without expectation, who had arrived out of little more than curiosity, felt themselves changed. They realized they were no longer mere spectators. They had become part of a moment that would outlive the night itself, a moment that would be carried in memories and retold as a story of hope for years to come. At the front, Ethan sat quietly, still holding his mother's hand. She bent down toward him, her own eyes wet with tears, and whispered through a trembling smile, "You did more tonight than any preacher ever could." Her words were not exaggeration. They were the truth spoken plainly. For it had not been the carefully crafted sermon nor a polished testimony that had moved the room. It had been the innocent courage of a boy daring to ask a question and the broken, honest answer of a man who finally allowed himself to be seen. In the days and weeks that followed, people in the town would tell the story again and again. The story of an old man who had nearly lost everything, who had buried his faith under years of bitterness and sorrow, and of a boy whose simple words cut through all of it and brought him back. What began as an ordinary evening in a crowded hall became a legend of transformation, whispered across fences, retold in kitchens, remembered in prayers. But for Jerry Adler, it was more than a story to be retold. It was the beginning of something new. For the first time in decades, he no longer felt forgotten, no longer invisible. The silence he had carried was broken, and in its place was the faint but steady rhythm of hope. He knew the road ahead would not erase the past, but it no longer needed to. He had been reminded, by a child's question, that even the most wounded soul can awaken again. And so, that night, the room was indeed filled with tears. Not tears of grief, nor of hopelessness, but tears of release and of wonder. Tears that came from seeing with their own eyes that no life, however broken, was beyond the reach of light. Even the most fragile soul, long buried under sorrow, could rise again to life.